Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sue Ann Jackson from the State Unit on Aging, and we are excited today to welcome you to the webinar, APS, 5 Things You Should Know. Here in the room with me, I have Sandy Abrams and Valerie Eames and Joan Medlin. This is our 4th or 5th in the series this year. I think it's the 5th in our SUA webinar series. And this one is really geared for those of you out there in the ADRC community and OPI and options counselors and family caregivers to get some information that you might need to do your daily work. We are recording the webinar today, and we will keep you guys all muted, but you can text chat questions. And also, if you're a group site and you have more than one person listening at your place of business on your line, please let us know who else is there with you so we can keep track of that. They are going to answer questions kind of as they come up, unless they look like it's going to be a little more complicated, but they do have some natural breaks in the presentation, so they will get to the questions. We did send out materials yesterday. If you registered after we sent them, there's a handout section that you can pull the PowerPoint down. And if that doesn't work for you, send an email to Lori, L-O-R-I .c, as in cat, .watt, W-A-T-T, at state.or.us. And just in the subject line, say, need webinar materials. And she'll be able to send that to you. Watch it sometime in the half hour or so after the webinar, you'll get an email with a Survey Monkey that will be an evaluation to let us know how we did and what you thought and how that worked for you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie and Joan.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Valerie Eames, and I'm with the Office of Adult Abuse Prevention and Investigations, called ADRC, and I'm a policy analyst, mainly working with adult protective services, and I've been doing that for about 14 years up at the state level, and then for 6 years I was APS specialist in Benton County doing the direct APS work.
My name is Joan Medlin, and I am a training specialist at AWAPI. I'm not going to say the long name, it's too hard. And for a couple of years before that, I was working with the Home Care Commission, setting up the PSW training program and learning all about in-home support. Outside of that, I've spent 25 years working in the developmental disability community as a registered dietitian, providing in-home support, coaching families on how to help folks live more independently, learn to make their own choices about their health and their food and cooking skills and all that good stuff. And then adding on to that, I am the mother of a 28-year-old who experiences disabilities, and that makes all this work about helping folks have the tools that they need to live as independently as possible, regardless of who they are, an important concept in my life. So with that, we're going to, we're going to move forward. We need to click on the slide. Oh, there we go. And we have today's objectives. Just so you know, we always have to start with objectives, right? So we're hoping that by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to summarize the role of adult protective services, list the types of abuse recognized in Oregon, describe ways to collaborate with adult protective services. So we're really gearing this to things that are very basic, and then in the next webinar we will move on to things that you can do that you need to know for your job. And I'm rambling, so I will stop.
Yes, we will. We'll go in more depth about the types of abuse in the next webinar, so you'll get that information.
So we wanted to start with a poll, and Sue Ann's going to bring that up. And we're just curious how many years you've been working in this field as an ADRC staff member, a service coordinator, a case manager, any aspect of that. And just click the radio button next to how long you've been working in this field, and it'll be fun for us to see. I think so. We're all learning about polls while you do it. We've not seen them before, so we don't want to cut anybody off. You just have to close it for us to see how you vote.
So one last chance to vote, if you haven't already.
Oh, come on, get us to the 90%.
Everybody hasn't voted yet.
All right, here we go. We don't know. We have to share it. We have to share. Need to help. Back to the other one. Well, can you? I bet you guys can see. We can't see. Sorry, I don't know how to say.
Well, I saw it that it was in the mid-45 for once over 5 years. There was nobody that was brand new under 6 months. So that helps us gauge it. Okay, let's move on.
Technical stuff.
We minimize the PowerPoint.
Yep. And then I gotta do this back again.
And then minimize go back up here.
What do you think? Now go back to this.
Close I just close this. There we go.
And they are looking at the poll results.
Okay, so you know how many of you worked wherever? Where do you see it? The percentage. Oh, there. Now they're there. Perfect. Oh, we don't know what we're doing here. I hope you're enjoying listening to all of us figure out what we're up to.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for being patient with us, guys.
And that helps us get ready for the next one.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So I wonder if it's just they're now viewing poll results. Yeah. You want to hide it. There we go. Yeah. There we go. So that's you.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is Adult Protective Services for those that aren't familiar with it. So it is it's an APD program, you know, like ADRC is a program, or OPI, and we're part of the continuum of care that Aging and People with Disabilities gives to our consumers, and we're over in the continuum of investigating and preventing harm. So I want to, we serve the same populations that you do with Adult Protect, older adults over the age of 65, individuals with physical disabilities, but they don't have to be registered for services with physical disabilities. They just have to identify themselves as having a disability. And then, of course, residents in APD facilities. And I want to make sure when I use some terms that you understand what they are if you're not familiar with APS jargon. So APS stands for Adult Protective Services. The individuals in the local office that do the work are called Adult Protective Service Specialists that do the investigations and protective services. Reported victims would be the people that are reported that make our protected populations that may have been abused. And then, excuse me, then the reported perpetrator or RPs is the person that's suspected or being accused or alleged of abuse. Complainant, which some of you will be, is the person that calls in the report, and you have confidentiality on that. I don't know. Okay. All right. So when we go out to investigate, we're only mandated and can only investigate those situations that rise to the definitions of abuse. Like we do not do rule violations or those pieces. And while some of you do direct customer services, we don't do that. And all of us work together for the APD goal to ensure the safety and protection of our consumers and also work on prevention. Sorry, my throat's allergy. Okay. Yeah, you want, okay, I can, right. Yeah, why don't you, while I go out and try to.
She's got to clear her throat, so I'm gonna take it on for a little bit until Valerie comes down. So APS conducts a specific set of activities, and those include screening, triage, consultation, on-site assessment, investigation interventions, writing a report about what they've done, and APS risk management. All of this, of course, is dictated in your OARs, and is really far more prescriptive than you realize. So screening, I think a lot of you are involved in the screening, especially the ADRC staff. You get a lot of calls that you're going to screen and think about, and at some point there's a triage. What are we going to do with this report that we have? And there's some specific guidelines on how to do that. They consult with folks. They go to the site to see what they can learn and conduct a thorough investigation if they decide to refer it on for investigation. So I think you have the idea for that. I hate to ask for questions while Valerie's out of the room because she's, of course, the more learned one in this area. But do you have any questions at this point? Because our next activity is a little poll. And if you do, maybe type them in the text chat box. So far, where? Here? Yeah, there, and we don't have any yet. We don't have any yet. So we're going to move on to the next poll. If I can figure out how to do this, everybody's left. That's here, this one. There we go. So we wanted to know what you thought might be how many investigations were conducted in 2015. I have to launch it. I'm getting there. How many investigations were conducted by APS in 2015? A, 1,499. B, 4,258. C, 16,857. Or D, 32,497. This is a trick question to see if I know how to answer these big numbers.
Thanks for bearing with us as we've not used polls in these before, but we know we can. So we appreciate you guys being our guinea pigs to let us try it out. We'll give you about another half minute to vote here. A little bit more time. Those of you who haven't voted, get your vote in. What do you think the number is? Okay, it looks like most people have voted, so let's close it and we'll share it. So most of you chose C, which is 16,867.
Yes.
What do we have for them, Valerie?
I'm very impressed, you know, for educated guessing for some of you might know, but that's really the range. There's a little over 100 APS specialists. So the other numbers do mean something. The $14.99 is the total amount that developmental disability investigators, and they're the next largest group of abuse investigative programs for adults. The next number, the 4,001, is how many facility APS investigations there were. So there was over 12,000 investigations done in community APS, which is in the home of individuals that aren't in facilities. And then the 32,000 is how many calls we received for APS screening in 2015 for the screening.
50 people.
Yeah, so this gives you a little perspective on who we are in APD. Okay, so Joan's now going to go over the abuse, what is abuse?
So, you know, sometimes we ask that question, well, what is abuse? And there's a typo on this slide, perhaps, but I can't see it underneath the box. There are 8 types of abuse plus self-neglect. Yeah, so change that 9 to 8 plus self-neglect. And they're all defined by the OARs and ORS. They're in statute. And we have that statute down below for you so that you can look it up for yourself if you need to. It's 411-020-002. Parentheses 1 and parentheses 38 is the self-neglectful. So we're going to run through just a brief definition of each one of these. And so the first one is physical abuse. And that doesn't need a whole lot of defining for you, but it's using physical force that may cause pain or harm, or a physical injury that is not an accident. And some of the things to consider there is that typically physical abuse is when someone intends to do harm. And we'll go into, oh, she says no. We'll go into more detail in a little bit. So the next one.
And I just want to jump in at this point. If you have your hand raised, you need to text chat us or question. If there's an issue or a technical issue, we're not able to open your phone line or anything like that. So thank you.
Okay. So next up is neglect, which is not providing for the basic care or health and safety of a vulnerable person when there's a responsibility to do so. That means, for instance, providing the assistance the person needs to be able to get through their day, more focus on the activities of daily living, making sure that they are able to take their bath. And sometimes when there's a referral made, part of what happens at APS is that's something that can happen. For example, if a family member has been coming every morning to help a person get out of bed who needs assistance getting out of bed and getting dressed for the day, and they've been coming for the last 6 months every morning, and then suddenly they don't come, or they decide it's too hard and they only do half of the job, and the person experiences some harm based on that, that can be a problem. And we're looking for that pattern of providing assistance. We need more than one computer when we do this. Yeah. The next type of abuse is self-neglect, and we will go into self-neglect in much more detail in a little bit. Self-neglect is different in that it doesn't involve someone doing something wrong, but it does involve harm or risk. So the person may be at risk of harm or experiencing harm based on the choices that they've made, and they don't necessarily understand the consequences of those choices. So it's an important type of tech, and here we've got it as an abuse, but it's really different from abuse. It's just some type of neglect in a way. Abandonment is another type of abuse, and I'll tell you, since I started working at AWAPI, we talk a lot about what is abandonment in different meetings and conversations, and it's deserting or leaving the person for whom you have agreed to provide care, resulting in harm or risk of serious harm. And for as much as we talk about that, it's about 1% of the APD cases are abandonment. So it doesn't happen very often. And I think we talk about it so much because there are things that might feel like they're abandonment, leaving someone in the car while you run inside. But that's really a type of neglect. And most of the things that you think might be abandonment might fall under neglect. And that's not your job as the screener or as the person, the case manager, to decide what type of abuse that is. It's if it feels wrong, you want to call that in and make sure that people know. Next up is verbal or emotional abuse. And that's a written, spoken, or gesture directed to the vulnerable person that causes them significant anguish or distress. And what's important about this is that you see, for instance, in this picture, this gal's got her finger going and she's clearly, distressing this man. And perhaps he can't even hear her, but that wouldn't matter because he's obviously feeling some threat here. So they don't have to necessarily have the capacity to hear or the capacity to see. They might have a visual impairment, they might not be able to see. But if it's directed to that person as a threatening gesture, then that would fall under this category. Next up is financial abuse, and this is probably one of the ones we see the most, or we hear about the most, and it's one of the types of abuse that we can take action on that can become a criminal offense. But it's really just taking people's money or things. You don't have permission, the person didn't choose to share with you and you decided that they should. Taking medication from the person, that's a theft of financial exploitation. If they have a prescription medication that you think might be fun to take home with you, that's not something that you can do. You're stealing their medication. Or if you are responsible for helping them make their bills, take care of the payments for the services and items that they need, their food, their clothing, and you choose to spend their money in another way, and they are feeling harm or they're at risk of harm, that can be financial exploitation. In our office, we have a person who can provide you technical assistance, who's a specialist in financial exploitation. Her name is Billy McNeely, and you can either email us. We have an email at the end of the slideshow for tech assistance. You can either email that email, or you can email Billy, BILLIE .McNeely, MCNEELY @state.or.us, and she'd be happy to staff situations with you if you're having questions about something that's happening. Next up is sexual abuse, and that's unwanted sexual contact. Pretty much anything that you think is wrong and is around the topic of sex is probably something we need to talk about and staff and decide if it's something we need to follow up on. It can be a crime, it can be sexual harassment, and an important part of this is that when you're looking at support folks, the rules define that sexual contact with a paid provider is sexual abuse unless they're married, unless they are spouses. And that's an important thing to know, that that's in the rule. And it's there to protect folks from people who might want to take advantage. And we'll talk a little more about that later on in the slideshow as well. We also have a specialist in the office who deals with domestic violence and sexual abuse cases. Excuse me. And her name is Deborah Holton. You can email the technical assistance email that will be at the end of the show, or you can email Deborah, DEBORAH .Holton, HOLTON @state.or.us. Excuse me, Valerie's giving me her cough. The next type of abuse is one that is an important one to keep in mind. I think you've heard on the news a number of times that one of the biggest red flags of abuse is when someone's isolated. So a type of abuse here is involuntary seclusion, which includes restricting contact or activities with family or friends, people they want to see, and you're not letting them see them. Restricting their phone or their access to email or their access to their mail. Restricting movement by limiting them to an area of the house, telling them they need to stay in the bedroom, or they need to stay in the basement, whether it's just for a period of time or whether it's just for your convenience. That's all involuntary seclusion. So you want to think about that when you're listening to people on the phone. If somebody sounds like they're being real controlling about where a person's going in the house, that might be a red flag for you. Another type of abuse is physical or chemical restraint, and that's using a medication to get a person to sleep or have a bowel movement, or for the day to go in a way that's for the convenience of the caregiver, but not for the person. And then also any kind of physical restraint, like tying them to the bed. That used to be real popular long ago, so that they wouldn't pick at themselves or whatever. Even raising the bed rail is considered a physical restraint if they are unable to put those bed rails down themselves and get out of the bed, and no one's there to assist them if they request it. Earlier, Valerie and I were talking of sharing stories about our lives, and when I was 100 years ago, when I was first a registered dietitian in a nursing home, I knew that this was wrong, but I didn't have the words to talk about it or know what to do with it. And it was that they were giving everyone a laxative at a certain time. Each wing had their day that they got this laxative, and that was for the convenience of the caregiver. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen anymore. I won't say I'm sure of it, but I'm hoping it doesn't happen anymore. But that could happen in the home as well. Somebody could think, well, I don't have time to deal with that tomorrow, but so I'm going to give them a laxative so that they've been a little constipated. We'll take care of this now while we can. And then another good example that Valerie brought up that's much more common sounding is, for instance, someone sitting in a lazy boy, putting the footrest up, and the person who's in the chair does not have the ability to put the footrest down or get out of the chair. And that's a type of restraint. So you want to listen for those kinds of things where they're trying to manage the person so that their day can go better, whether it's physical or chemical.
Yeah. Also, I want to let you know, there are some exceptions for medical. You need a thorough assessment and a medical order, and, it's at least, it's the last resort.
You're right. If you're using medication for behavior, you absolutely need a behavior assessment, and you need the medical involved before you get a prescription for any kind of medication to change behavior. Absolutely. do you have any questions? Why don't we open the poll, which is what is not abuse in Oregon? You have 4 options there. The home care worker borrows a consumer's medication for headaches, locking a consumer in a bedroom all day. C is the home care worker and a consumer becoming a consenting sexual couple. D is the home care worker and consumer both mutually swear when they talk to each other. And so while we're answering that question, if you have any questions of us, please feel free to type them in the text box, the question box.
We don't have any yet.
Okay. It's a good time to do that. Look, they all left their computers.
No, it's 100%. There are 47 of those. 47. Again, we want to thank you guys for bearing with us on these polls that we're just learning how to use. It's really kind of fun. Hope it's fun for you guys to have a little interaction. We appreciate those of you who have sent us lists of people that are watching the webinar at your site. Looks like about 67% have voted, so we'll give you a few more seconds here. Is there any question in the box? No, it'll come up with a question. Oh, does it? So it'll tell us right under that hand door.
And you might remind them of it.
Yeah, we're looking for what's not abuse in this one. So it looks like the majority is voted. We're going to close. We'll give you just a few more seconds. If anybody hasn't voted, go for it. Okay, we're going to close the poll and share the results.
Go. And the majority of you got it right. The answer is D. The home care worker and the person that they work for both swear all the time with each other, and it's just the way they talk. It's their culture. It's the way they talk. It's not considered abuse at all. C, I saw a few people had C as their answer, and the issue there is that they're becoming a consenting sexual couple, which feels like it shouldn't be wrong, but according to the OARs, they need to be married to be able to be a sexual couple.
ORSs, yeah, right, yeah, with the statutes, and so when that law was passed, it used to be could have relationships if it was a caregiver and it was consenting, but prosecutors weighed in and they won. That's what they asked for. So there was a change. And then there were a few that did, yeah, the bike victim, yeah, that's still with consent, you know, Vicodin's a controlled substance, it's a narcotic, so there's a problem there. And
Whether or not
and
they're
medication,
a vulnerable person. But if it was, say, Tylenol, I don't know if it would rise to the level of abuse or not. You have to think about whether you're borrowing somebody's property. So it depends on how often you're doing it. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Valerie.
and hopefully my voice is better now. Okay, so the next section, we're going to be talking about you, and this goes a little bit more to the service providers. It's trying to distinguish when you call protective services or when it would be like a case manager or a service, you know, coordinator issue. To give you some parameters to make some decisions to call, but when you're staffing with APS, why they might tell you that they're not going to screen it in and they think that it would best fit to stay with the service person. So some of the difference between what an APS specialist does and a service person does is APS, we don't do direct services, you know, we don't set up medical we're not first responders like 911 or, yeah, or EMTs or police officers. We're more like the emergency room where people in crisis, which is harm, we get it stabilized. And we also don't do long-term direct care in totally fixed situations. So like in an ER, once they get to our emergency department, once they get it stable, they're moved on to the hospital or rehab center or back home with care. So that's similar to APS. So if an APS is working on one of your cases, once they work through the protective service and the investigation, it'll be going back to you. Okay. So generally it stays, if you're staffing with a screener with APS, or you're deciding to call in, some situations are just gray, and we're using the language here where it borders on the definition of abuse. It might be you have a granddaughter that's a home care worker, and she keeps the change when grandma gives her a 20 to go shopping. So the first time that happens, you might need to be reminded that the rules have changed, that she now has a professional relationship with grandma, and maybe that was what happened in the past, but it can't happen now. So you probably wouldn't want to turn that into APS. And then usually work with issues with skills, ability, and knowledge, and the background and support that they need. I'm sorry, can we go back just one? There's one point, the green point at the bottom. I just want to do a call out here that on occasion you'll have situations where both, or APD has, where both APS and the case manager is highly involved, because it's like all hands on deck. If it's like threatening, or there's someone that's violent in the home, but the consumer's not ready for them to move out, but it's really dangerous. I just want to let you know that it's not always an or, it's more of an and situation. Okay. So when it goes to APS, is if it clearly makes a definition of abuse under law, APS has to investigate. Also, if you have one of these gray zones, if there's any significant outcome or consequence to the situation, that it should go to APS. So if you're fence sitting and there's somebody's moving somebody and they accidentally drop them and break a hip, that's automatically APS. It doesn't make any difference if they were trying to do the right thing. It's for APS to find out if there was neglect involved. And also, sometimes you're going to have providers where it's kind of borderline, like real low verbal, and we'll talk about this. We'll give specific examples. If it continues, is as a service coordinator, the provider, should know or has been told that it shouldn't happen, and they keep doing it, that also really bumps it up to APS.
And we were talking earlier, I think it's really important that people know when they refer something to APS, if it doesn't feel right and you refer it on to Adult Protective Services, it may still come back without being investigated. It's not your job to know whether it fits the rule for abuse or not. That's something that happens after it goes on to APS. But the APS specialist can staff with you to help you understand why it came back and what supports and services might be good, or what did they learn in their discussion. before it came back to you.
Right, because some of these gray areas, it does take staffing. In a sense, there's a little bit of ethical decision, you know, making, and consumers have self-determination, and a lot of times, like home care workers can be natural support, so they have those sort of boundaries, and then boundaries of being a provider is different. And then, yeah, so they have to work out one of those. So we're going to go through the different sorts of abuse and kind of like talk a little bit about this difference to give you some parameters on how to think about it, or how APS would think about it. So under the statute for physical abuse, clear accidents, we don't investigate. Sometimes we would investigate to determine if it's an accident. And then if you have a new provider, which is entry level, and so some rough handling that it's a lack of skills and knowledge, and it's not come like, they really don't know how to transfer someone, so there's a little tugging and stuff. That might be a situation where education and intervene and trying to get them, especially in the home situations where they don't have the support like they do in facilities of an administration to overwatch those, you know, could be remaining with you. But if you go over to the APS specialist list, you know, any type of physical harm, especially if it involves violence, any forced feeding, any type of, you know, physical punishment for discipline, or, you know, horrid pleasure, which unfortunately runs into APS. But you see, if the tugging or not knowing how to do transfer despite education continues and can't be remedied, then it's definitely APS, because maybe this is a person that should not be working with a dependent adult on care, an adult that has dependent needs. And then if any rough handling that's wrongful conduct, like sometimes you can tell it's not, you can tell they're trying to do the right thing as opposed to kind of callous about it, and that's the result. APS would look into that, and of course, if there's any real significant negative outcome like bruises, or it's very distressful to the consumer. Okay. So neglect is the next one. Where, yeah, APS isn't involved in housekeeping or instrumental activity, you know, like laundry or how often they clean out the refrigerator. That's not something that we do. Sometimes providers they might not do pericare the correct way, which is not okay if you're a consumer, but maybe it's just a situation that they should have the skills in the home, they might not know about it. And then I use the word care plan. I know some of you work with task lists and stuff. If they're not doing all those, usually the first intervention is for whoever's supervising them from APD or whoever, or refer them to Home Care Commission to get some education. So APS for neglect, you know, the medications, especially with any risk, would definitely go to APS. Not following serious needs and care plans would go to APS. And if there's any patterns or continuing and with general care, maybe it could be skills, abilities, and knowledge, but it might also be an APS issue. So abandonment. So some in the way the rules are done with, if the provider leaves an individual, somebody willing and able to provide care, and they decide to quit, that might be a rule violation, like if they're a home care worker or an in-home provider, or, through the home care commission, it would be, that might not rise to ATS. And, a single provider in the home, they have to go to the bathroom and stuff, so if something happens, that might reach an accident thing, and so that's something that would have to be. Where the abandonment, if they just quit and no one's present, so it's just basically deserting the person, they get sick of it and just walk off, that usually would rise up to abandonment.
Valerie,
Yes?
this is Sandy, and I just
Yes.
have a quick question. A lot of our staff sometimes use, or not use, but consumers use family members as caregivers.
Right.
And private pay, not home care workers
Okay,
through the
they
home
do,
care commission.
okay.
So in those cases, when they desert them, as you were saying,
Right.
or abandon them, is that something that would be an appropriate?
Yeah, so remember from Joan talking, abandonment is neglect. And so one of the elements to prove neglect is someone has assumed care for an individual who needs care. So irregardless if it's natural support, which is usually verbal agreements or behavior, or paid, which right there, what they get paid to do is what they assume. So, if they just get paid to be there during the daytime and something happens at night, they haven't assumed the night responsibility for that. So yes, that would be for that. So yeah, we have like somebody's doing the work day, someone has a home care worker or paid private, and then on the weekend the family steps in. Well, if the family decides to go to Las Vegas for a weekend and just sort of abandon somebody,
It doesn't set up care.
care, so that person doesn't get medications or whatever, that would be considered desertion.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So,
And Valerie, got a question.
okay,
What happens when a client abuses a caregiver? What is the caregiver's accountability, and what is our accountability to report? And can you describe examples when this might occur within families?
okay. So, this does happen. Sometimes, this sometimes happens in domestic violence situations, might be a classic, where the spouse that's the batterer, so to speak, needs care from the spouse that they've abused them, and they can continue to verbally batter them. Then it's, for those sort of situations, that probably made it more complicated, but yeah.
Well, for instance, when I was
Okay.
working at the home care commission, we have a number of times when people would say, but he's always so mean to me, or it's sexual harassment to me because he calls me honey, or there's times when people slap. And oftentimes when something happens and I'm going to hone in on, say, physical abuse just because it's easy, but when a caregiver is quote unquote abused, oftentimes it's because the person they're providing support for is communicating something and they don't have the words or the ability to process that or say it. We're not always logical, calm people. So for instance, my mother-in-law, who experienced quite a bit of dementia and also had bipolar disorder, was living
at the coast, and she had a place that she would go all the time for breakfast. And they did a good job of accommodating her and her needs. But one of the things that she didn't like was strangers touching her or bumping her. And if somebody came by, they would put her at a table on purpose where she never would get touched or bumped because it frightened her. She couldn't tell us why it frightened her, it just did. And so her reaction to that was one of fight or flight for her. So she would stand up and slap the person. When she moved into assisted living, the same thing was occurring. And it would be the same if you were a family member providing support. We all knew to say, Mary, I'm coming up behind you. Mary, I'm going to move this chair. And in the case of my son, who's also nonverbal, we'd say, Mary, Andy's coming by. You might want to come this way, because he had the same issue. So you had to accommodate both of them. But the OARs and the statutes are here to protect the vulnerable person. And if the caregiver is feeling abused, then there's training that needs to happen there. And there's questions about if the person's receiving services, there'd be questions about the care plan. Are they getting the support that they need to feel safe in that environment? What is it that person is trying to communicate? So that's really kind of where that situation would end up going.
Yeah. So a lot of it matters who's the protected person as far as APS.
Absolutely.
And then I was kind of went to a situation where maybe both are protected people. And so those are, where APS work can be very difficult trying to piece that out, and, has a lot to do with, capacity. And so that's an excellent question, and a lot of it depends on the details of the situation. If you need to talk more about that, you could contact us afterwards, or Sandy would be available too. Okay, so verbal abuse. So we need to look at how does it impact the individual, and how does taking action impact the individual. So especially like family systems, you have bickering, poor social skills, and sometimes, and I hate to say it, but it's just as the reality, we would look at a situation and feel like it's low-level domestic violence, but the victim, because of self-determination, doesn't want to take action. So sometimes they're not actionable, but need to be watched, and there are ways to intervene sometimes to change that dynamic. But for APS, we definitely get involved if there's any type of threatening behavior, intimidation, bullying, ridicule, cussing that's not mutual, that's a form of intimidation. Also, let's say on this example of borderline family, low-level verbal domestic violence, if there's a real pattern of emotional damage, like if somebody's acting or they're talking about walking on eggshells, that's kind of bumped it up, because that is anguish, and it gives an idea that violence has become normalized in that situation, even if they say that it's okay. And then any type of intense verbal blitz attacks where somebody just explodes in anger and hits walls or screams in a fearful, terrifying way, that should be reported to APS. Okay, financial exploitation. This kind of gets into another gray area. As mentioned, a lot of providers are paid providers or natural support, so they might not return the change the first time. So you could report it to APS to discuss it, or you might, be dealing with it to explain that the rules have changed and that's not okay. Accepting gifts. This is, in the home care rules, there are accommodations for giving gifts to family members, like, birthdays, Christmas. But, a $400 transmission job might, might not go into, the gift, the gift, or if there's undue influence in, trying to get gifts, yeah. So it kind of depends on, professional judgment of the spirit of the gift given. Generally, we don't deal with timesheets or voucher issues. That would go to overpayments, and APD has other mechanisms for that. For us, it's medication, especially any type of narcotic, ATM cards without permission, any type of theft. And the bottom one is, a lot of you who work in the home setting, there's sometimes power of attorneys that involve POAs, and sometimes they're not spending the person's money to benefit them. They're either saving it for their inheritance, hoping, that some relative will die soon, or going to Hawaii so you can be in a better mood is not a direct benefit to the consumer. A fiduciary is a person of trust. It's supposed to, we always consider it, use it for the consumer's benefit. Okay, involuntary seclusion. So it's not, if you're asking someone to stay in their bedroom where the carpets are clean, or they can't use the living room because it's just been painted for a short term, that's not seclusion. So a debatable area in the home might be that the provider's not aware that having a bedtime, in quotes, it's really seclusion. You're telling, these are adults, they should get to go, and especially with the home and community-based care route, they get treated like any other Oregon citizen and adults and get to choose their bedtime. So that's something that you would work with, most likely the home care worker. But then if they keep it up and they won't let go of the bedtime idea, then that could possibly be APS. And then the restraining order, let's say APS was involved and we got a restraining order, and then the son tried to visit again, and the provider called the police and it was taken care of. You don't necessarily might have to bring APS in because it's a set-up situation. It's only if it keeps persisting. So, over on the other, the isolating individuals, punishing, or behaviors that don't change when they're explained that it's not okay to do, bumps it up. Any other, questions?
Not yet.
Okay, then we get into wrongful restraint, which is what we were talking about with the chemical or physical restraint. So if the individual has a PRN for sleeping and they request it, that's perfectly fine. It's just the caregiver can't suggest it in order so they could get an earlier bedtime out of it. And it's not wrongful restraint if a person's, caregiver's out walking with a consumer and the consumer starts to step into traffic and they grab their arms to hold them back, a little, that's not considered wrongful restraint. But over on the other line, if these are used for convenience, and we went through most of these, and sometimes illegal drugs have been used as a chemical restraint. So now you can be grateful for sexual abuse because typically that always goes, well, not that it occurs, but dealing with it, because it's more black and white. This always should go to ATS because people tend to underreact or overreact. And it's just so, and you just can't take any risk with this. And there's so many variables that if you have any suggestions that it might be non-consensual or any type of sexual crime is involved, it needs to be reported. If it rises to the crime, it goes to law enforcement, but APS definitely has. And sometimes APS is called in because you can't tell if it's a consenting relationship.
This question is about inaccurate timesheets and use.
Yeah, I see it. So if you're getting into forging and that sort of thing, so some of that might be Medicaid fraud or overpaying.
We don't have Medicaid fraud in the
Okay,
OPI program.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
Right. So
it's general fund. I'm
right.
sorry.
So this is a great question about what to do when you're seeing this. And essentially, it's when a home care worker is not being accurate with their timesheet. And the key here needs to be, what is the AAA paying for through OPI? And what they are not paying for, how that is being met financially by the family, by the consumer. And that needs to be pretty well explained. If it appears that the consumer is being financially exploited, so for example, they're paying $30 a day for the cat box to be changed. And that's like a 10-minute activity. Yeah. Then that does seem to be over and abundant. And that's when you would want to staff it with APS and have a conversation. You can always feel free to call me here at the central office so we can explore options. And particularly if you're questioning if there's fraud. If the consumer does not appear to be signing the timesheet, if their rep may not be aware of the actual thing. We don't have access to the Medicaid fraud unit because these are state dollars. The Medicaid fraud unit really represents the federal dollars of it. But what we do have access to is what is the right thing, and we have legal, so we can certainly look at whether there are charges that should be pressed, as well as the Home Care Commission and response to the home care worker and the situation that they get into.
Do they go to overpayment?
Yes, they can, if that appears to be the necessary route.
Which is, they're the ones that would look at fraudulent signatures usually. And sometimes these do involve APMs and overpayments. So it's it's an and situation, but generally, yeah, the payment piece for care is separate. Yeah.
Right. Good question.
Yeah, also on the domestic violence one or this interfamily violence, Deborah Holton, who works with Arapi, this is their specialty. And so you can call up and discuss this, or you can call, we'll talk a little bit later. You can also staff these with APS or screen it and try to figure out where the boundaries are. Some of these, like I said, we're going into a gray zone. And it's always good to staff it. Always err on the side of seeing if APS should be involved, or we might have some ideas. other questions, and remember the next one, we're gonna go over abuse a lot more in detail. This is just kind of giving you a sense for, you know, especially working in the homes, which is not a regulated environment, that things can become very, very gray, and that's hard to deal with. So this is some ways to think about it. Yes.
They keep talking about the next one. What we didn't tell you in the
Oh,
beginning
sorry.
is that this is a two-part series, and we asked them to talk about APS in general this time in May. And then in June, they're going to focus more on the mandatory reporting aspect of the whole
Right.
thing. So, yeah.
Okay.
So I think we are ready to do,
Right.
does this have a poll or is it just a hand raise? No, this is it. Okay. So
Here's
gonna read it
what
tonight,
we're
right?
gonna talk about here. Let's see it there. Oh, it's the discussion scenario.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the question. You receive a phone call, and the caller's father used some medication to manage his pain for years. So this is like his daughter. And she's saying that her dad's been using medication to manage his pain for years. But you got a call the other day from his doctor because you're the healthcare person that he likes to call, and you're on the list with HIPAA approval. And he says he's noticed that your father's been calling in for more pain medication, and he's been complaining more that his pain isn't managed. And the doctor's asking you if you've noticed any kind of changes in his status, or asking the daughter. And she's calling you because she doesn't know what to do with this. The doctor called you. The doctor's concerned that his patient, your client, is medication seeking. So what do you think about this at this stage? Is that something that you want to ask, that you think that you would be referring to APS or handling as a case manager, or do you need more information before you decide what to do?
And there's been a poll posted, so go ahead and respond to the poll. While you're doing this, I would just like to encourage you that if you're having questions as we've covered material, to feel free to go ahead and type in those questions so that we can respond to them.
So we'll give just a few more seconds. It looks like most people have voted. So just a few more seconds. Would you refer this to APS? Would you want more info, or would you just go ahead and work with it? Those of you group sites, I'm wondering what your process is to come to consensus. Okay, we're going to close the poll. So I'm really proud of you. You all chose, the biggest answer was, you need more information, that you want to ask a few more questions. And then some of you were referring it to APS. And before I go to the next part of this, I'm going to say that both of those answers would be okay. Would be okay. I guess we need to hide it.
Yeah, and even the case manager maybe keeping it at this point and being aware that maybe they need to be on alert, but keeping it would be okay.
But what ends up happening is after you hear this whole story and you're a little concerned, there's more discussion while you're on the phone. And so as you talk with them, you learn the following things. You learn that there have been medication irregularities for months. The daughter goes over and she sees it. Well, why isn't his medication box filled? What's going on with this? The healthcare workers, however, somehow always has an explanation for this. She's a real fast-talking healthcare worker. But the daughter's piecing it together that her dad's pain was well controlled before the home care worker was hired. Does that change what you might do? Would you then refer that on to APS?
So we don't have a poll for this one, so just think
Just
about
talk
it.
about it among yourselves, but I would probably refer it on to APS. That's what I would do.
Just a little bit more information makes a big difference.
And sometimes that's what, if you don't have access to that information, that's what the investigator or the screener is going to find out when they're triaging the case. and then they'll know whether to refer it on or to take it back. So next up, we're going back to Valerie with, what is self-neglect, or why is that different? Self-neglect is not technically an abuse type. It's a little bit different, and Valerie's going to explain that to you.
Yeah. So one is that it has two parts. One is that there's some kind of harm done or risk of serious harm to the consumer, and the other piece is that the consumer does not have the capacity or the ability to make decisions or understand the consequences. So a lot of times with self-neglect, it ends up staying with the service coordinator or case manager unless there's a benefit to involve APS if the person has capacity to make decisions. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, the next slide. So this is one way, and this is a way to think not only about self-neglect, but about all the abuses that you'd be looking if you're staffing to go to APS or if it's going to be dealt with the ATV side of it. What is the benefit to the consumer to have APS involved or the case manager? So part of that is who has the most relationship. A lot of times the case manager might have more relationship and have already developed trust and rapport. Who has the resources? Like APS, we don't have a lot of resources to direct services, like medical transport or those sort of things. So, and then a big one is how serious or imminent is the risk. So you have during the summer, if a consumer doesn't have, electricity because they're mad at the utility and they don't want to pay for it, that's a different situation than if you're in Eastern Oregon and it's winter time. So might have to bring in APS then. And then a big piece of it is the consumer functionally capable of being able to decide their risks and protect their own interests. And this is, so do they have a won't brain, meaning they can make some decisions, or do they have advanced capacity where they have a can't brain where they don't, where they can't decide rationally what it should be. And so a lot of the negative, self-neglect, even if we investigate it, it would just go right back to the case manager. So let's go to an example.
Well, we're going to do the poll.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's it. Example.
So do
Okay.
you want to?
Yeah, open that up. We have a question for you based on all that you've heard today. Can someone who's working with ATV make an adult stop drinking? Too much alcohol. Let's finish this question. We can go forward. Oh, it has both the question on it.
Yeah, we have to.
So we're giving you just a few more seconds. It looks like most of you or a majority of you have voted. Nobody's saying yes. Everybody's saying no.
Yeah, we didn't make it
Yeah,
very hard.
so everybody, yeah. Yeah, most
Good job.
people are, yeah. It's reality, and some of it gets into self-determination. Generally, somebody you know, incarceration. Even if somebody had a guardianship, it limits whether or not, you know, guardians can restrict alcohol in some situations. So
I love this question. They want to know if case managers ever give up.
The case managers, ADRC staff, OPI folks, service coordinators, anybody, do you guys give up? Yeah. Oh my gosh.
We'll give you just a few more seconds, but it's even Steven here.
I guess it comes down, what does give up mean?
Just a couple more seconds. It looks like most people have voted, so we'll
Oh yeah, they can't see why we're going, oh, look at that. So when we closed the poll, a few more of you said yes and no. I'm so sorry.
No, I think it's like, what does it mean? If you're giving up because it's a person's self-determination, you know, maybe that's what they mean, is that, you know, you shouldn't be forcing upon there. But a lot of times, or even with APS, is that we muddle through. You know,
So this is definitely a Valerie question, because she is our guardianship guru.
Right.
So the question is that the person has an OPI client that has dementia with no family, and they need a guardian, and this person is wondering if it would be expedited if APS gets involved, or should the case manager, service coordinator, OPI person pursue it?
And there's a history of APS involved.
Right.
Okay, so this has, I would staff, you'll have my contact information, and this is one that, because we don't have the time to go in, it can get kind of complicated. Sometimes APS could expedite it, and sometimes it doesn't.
Do they have to be Medicaid to get expedited?
No, it can be anyone. The issue is APD, there has to be someone to be the guardian. And I'm not going to go into it, but APS does pay for some protective proceedings for egregious situations, and I know the guardianship stuff really well.
So Amy, contact Sandy or I, and we'll make sure we get you in touch with Valerie so you can. Oh, it's on the end of your presentation.
Our contact information is in just a couple more slides.
Okay.
But yeah, we do staff those.
So, last is our question of, we're on number one, the last question, how can we support each other's work? And it's not as hard as it sounds. We need to think about each other. We need to report when you suspect abuse, when you see it. Those of you who are ADRC staff, service coordinators, or case managers out there in the field doing the work, report that suspected abuse when you see it or hear it. Supporting consumer rights, making sure that you've got the consumer as your first interest. They're who we work for and who we want to protect here. Sharing how to report abuse with others, and we'll talk more about that next month, all the different ways that you can report abuse, but making sure that people that you're working with or who you talk to know how to do that. And then providing background on the person you're working for, the consumer, to the APS specialist if you do refer something. The more information we have at the get-go, the better things go for the person who we're concerned about. So providing more information is absolutely an important thing to do. APS can support you in the following ways. We have specialists who can staff in the local offices, just the AAAs or just in the community.
The APS specialist.
And the APS specialist. And then providing technical assistance. And this is the email I was talking about earlier today, and it's in your handouts. You can send questions to the technical assistance email box. And if you forgot the financial exploitation person's name, but you really think you need some help with that, just say that in the email, and Catherine, who staffs that box, will make sure it gets to where it needs to go. How quickly do their things get answered at this box? almost immediately.
Yeah, we have somebody Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 that covers it.
Yeah, so, and if she doesn't know the answer, she sends out an email to all staff to get that answer right away. So,
Thank you.
and the guardianship piece, you could go there too.
Yeah, you can, to go on that, you can call me or use that.
And that's that third point, really, intervening on situations that involve involuntary interventions such as guardianship or commitments. You can send that information to the technical assistance box, and Catherine will get it to Valerie. So you get to Valerie a number of ways. So we're not going to, in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and do this one. But with whom might you staff the following? You referred to APS and it was screened out and you disagree. So could you talk to your supervisor, the APS specialist, to understand the decision, or send an email to a WAPI technical assistant? Or could you do all of those? And the answer, of course, is that you could do any one of those or all of them to get the answers about why this might not have worked.
Some of that depends on your local office protocols, like some of your supervisors want you to go to supervisor first before bumping up the central office.
So you do want to follow your in-house policies and procedures, but we are available to you if you are able to reach out to us. So we're going to do a quick little review. Number 5 was what are APS services, activities to investigate and prevent abuse and self-neglect for the population APD serves. Number 4, what is abuse? There are 8 types of abuse and self-neglect: physical abuse, neglect, abandonment, verbal or emotional abuse, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, involuntary seclusion, physical or chemical restraint, self-neglect. Number 3, when do I call Adult Protective Services? When the health and safety of consumers that's shared by all of us is at risk. If the situation doesn't feel right, despite your suggestions, call APS. So anytime you feel like it's if it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Number 2, why is self-neglect different? My page won't turn. Self-neglect is not abuse, and it doesn't involve another person doing the harm. It's typically because of the choices the individual makes creates the situation where they're at risk for harm.
So the self-determination of the consumer plays a big role in that.
Yep, understanding the choices that they make. And the last one, how do we support each other's work? We communicate with each other. And that's an important part of any work, any service work that you do, no matter where it is. Oh, look, and it gets big. Forgot about that. So next month, we'll come back on June 14th at 1:30 for our mandatory reporting, and you get the facts so that you understand your responsibility, the consequences of having that responsibility, and what you can share with others about reporting suspected abuse.
So that link isn't out yet, but we'll be getting it out in the next week or so keep an eye out for it.
You can put a placeholder on your calendar.
Yes, please.
And then there is our contact information, as promised. And we thank you for your time and your patience, and it's been wonderful to be here.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Valerie and Joan. We really appreciate it. Sandy and I have really both learned a lot, and apparently you guys did too, because you didn't have very many questions. But feel free to contact them or contact Sandy and I with questions that come up as you're thinking about things now that the webinar is almost over. Remember to watch in the next half hour or hour for a link that will be a Survey Monkey, and it shouldn't take you more than about 5 minutes, and just to let us know what you thought of today and whether you're going to use it, and if there's anything we can do to make next month even better, please feel free to fill it out. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.
Enjoy.